Welcome to the second of 3 housing deep dives. My name is Marva Galilulu, and I'm the new Learning and Member Engagement Specialist. A few housekeeping items before we jump in. First, as a continuing SVCN practice, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that each of us are on today. Next slide. In San Jose, California, we are living, learning, and organizing on the land of the Muwekma and Tanyamoloni tribes. Together, let us commit to educating ourselves and advocating for Indigenous peoples, communities neglected and displaced by the US government, and other colonial powers across the world. I know people are tuning in from different areas, so I encourage you to learn what land you're living on by using the website we'll share in the chat and share the information in your introduction. While I continue to go through today's guidelines, we'd love to learn who is in the room with us. Please introduce yourselves in the chat by sending your name, title and organization, pronouns, and native land. We'll recap the items to share. For accessibility purposes, we do have the automated closed captioning feature in Zoom activated. Next slide, please. Now with this, you do have the ability to move the captions around on your screen to a place more convenient, or you can disable the closed captioning feature entirely if you prefer to not have it up. To do so, please reference the bar at the bottom of your Zoom, click on Live Transcript on the right, and then click Hide Subtitles. If you're having any tech or other troubles during the session, please private message Dana directly in the chat. Next slide, please. We do ask that you remain on mute throughout the program and use the chat to send questions. Next slide, please. We're continuing with this housing series next week, where we'll cover facts versus fear, addressing Silicon Valley's housing crisis. Registration is open. And with that, I'd like to pass it to Nick Kawada, Policy Director for SVCN.
Thanks, Marva. Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Kawada, Policy Director of Silicon Valley Council of Nonprofits. My preferred pronouns are he, him, and I am excited to welcome you to our second webinar in our SVCN Housing A to Z series. Today, we will cover community ownership of land, so let's dive right in. But first, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. So, Andrea Portillo from Somas Mayfair, welcome. Wascott Castro from Working Partnerships USA, Regina Celestin Williams from SV at Home, and Asen NDI. Welcome you all thank you for being here today. Asen, I believe we're going to start with you. So I'm going to actually take a moment to add you guys and spotlight you. So just one moment, please, while I do that. All right, thank you. Asen, why don't you start us off?
Thanks so much for that introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Abubakar Asen NDI. I'm the former Partnership for the Bay's Future here in the city of San Jose. I worked for the last couple of years on the community opportunity to purchase. What I'm going to do is just get us started by giving folks a little bit of context on how we came to discuss and propose the community opportunity to purchase here in San Jose, and then talk a little bit about what that policy looks like and some of the elements. I want to sort of put it into the context of why the city of San Jose decided to look into community opportunity to purchase in the first place. In the mid-2010s or so, the housing crisis, which had already been growing in the region, really came to a head. There were a few very inflection points in the housing crisis, including the eviction of a 92-year-old World War II veteran, the mass eviction at a large apartment complex on the west side called the Reserve, and the announcement that Google would be moving into downtown San Jose, which created a lot of concern around potential displacement fears. Around that same time, the city really decided to try and look at ways that could address housing in a really comprehensive way. It's a concept known as the 3 Ps. And the 3 Ps are basically production, the idea that you need to build new housing as your population grows. Preservation, you need to preserve the housing that you have already in place and make sure that it can remain affordable over the long term. And finally, is protection. That's thinking about the families and the folks who already live in that housing and making sure that they don't have to worry about harassment, unrealistic or unaffordable rent increases, and are able to really remain safely housed. And so As the cities really started adopting this framework of the 3 Ps, one of the things that really became clear is that there was one piece that was still really not as robust. The city had done a lot of really great strides on production. There was some movement on protections, but there really was a need to really start focusing on preservation. Early in 2017, the city applied for a anti-displacement policy network of 10 cities around the country that included, cities like Portland and Seattle and Chicago and Boston and Nashville to try and look at what are some of the best ideas, what are some of the best practices in addressing displacement around the country. Out of that process came about a laundry list almost of 100 different policies. And we tried to whittle that down to try to think about what would be the best interventions to help address displacement in the city. Out of that work, which included working partnerships and Somos Mayfair, we came up with a community strategy report called the Community Strategy to End Displacement that included those strategies. That was turned into a citywide anti-displacement strategy that was adopted by City Council in September of 2020. Out of that strategy, Council directed staff to prioritize some of the more urgent potential policy interventions. Among those policies that were prioritized, that included the community opportunity to purchase. At the exact same time, again, the city received a 2-year grant to have someone come in and help work on the policy for 2 years. And that ended up being me, where we worked in conjunction with Smith there to help develop that policy, and eventually, hopefully, trying to get it passed. Next slide. So what is COPA? So community opportunity to purchase, it basically allows a nonprofit organization, usually or a community-based organization, to have the first chance or the first dibs essentially when a rental property goes up for sale. It generally needs to be paired with funding programs in order for the community organization to be able to purchase it. But it also creates a lot of opportunities to help build up the infrastructure for nonprofit partners like community land trust, limited equity, housing co-ops, smaller contractors, and other affordable housing developers. Next slide. At its core, what COPA does is that it creates an intervention in the process that allows for qualified nonprofits and tenants to work together to be able to prevent displacement. And what we mean by displacement is generally in cases where buildings are sold, many times that can trigger evictions, that can trigger repositionings or redevelopment of the property entirely, which then forces lower income people of color having to move out of those properties. What the community opportunity purchase does, it brings in a benevolent buyer who can come in, stabilize the property, and make sure that the folks who are there are able to stay there at an affordable price over the long term, and potentially even convert it to ownership in the long run. It also potentially could build community assets and help with economic empowerment. And then finally, in the current sort of economic space that we're in, it could potentially create a really great opportunity to help address what could potentially become an eviction crisis as COVID-19 fades. Next. So what does the COPA process look like? So it usually has it varies by different location, but it usually has the following steps. The property owner notifies a list of qualified nonprofits that they intend to sell the property. The qualified nonprofits get a certain period of time to be able to respond to that notice of sale if they're interested in purchasing the property. They're given a certain amount of time to do some tenant engagement and do some due diligence and put together an offer. The property owner is, given the absolute control and right to be able to to accept or reject that offer. And then if they end up rejecting the offer, all we ask is that the qualified nonprofit is able to make a counter offer or a final offer at the end. If the property owner and the qualified nonprofit come to terms, then we get a certain amount of time for financing and closing. Next slide. So what are the elements of a COPA process? So in order for a COPA process to be, or a COPA program to be successful, it usually includes all of these components. And so those components include applicability, which buildings are included in the program. The current city proposal would include all properties that are 2 and above with certain exemptions. It also gives a certain amount of time for the process to be able to go through. The city proposal currently would have 2 different timelines, one for smaller buildings and one for longer buildings, with the one for longer buildings being a little bit longer than the one for smaller buildings, just to match or at least be in the ballpark of existing market realities. The program would also propose a certain amount of experience requirements for qualified nonprofits and make sure that the properties stay affordable to working people in the city. And then finally, there would be a requirement for tenant engagement as part of the process, including a requirement to attempt to convert the properties to ownership over the long term. Finally, it would explore ways in which to leverage city funds as well as private funding in order to be able to finance the conversions. And then finally, would include a very long period of time for education of potential property owners, realtors, and other stakeholders, and make sure that there's an enforcement mechanism for repeated bad actors. Next slide. And just so that folks understand that community opportunity to purchase programs are not new, these are all the jurisdictions that currently have a program in place or is one that is considering it. I highlighted the ones that are either have it in place currently, which is Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, California, or the ones that are in the Bay Area and are currently working on opportunity to purchase programs, and that is Berkeley, Oakland, which is also in California, and East Palo Alto, which is also in California. Okay, next slide. All right, I'll pass it.
Thank you, Asen. So my name is Regina Celestin Williams. I'm very excited to be here to talk a little bit about work that I was able to do 15 years ago in Washington, D.C. First, I'll talk a little bit about the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act in the District of Columbia. It was established in 1980, and they do have funding, a local housing production trust fund that is available to support tenants in acquiring their buildings. It's not only used for that, but it's heavily used for that. So there's a dedicated funding source, which is critical. It's also focused on buildings that have more than 5 units, but there is flexibility within that particular act to make sure that vulnerable populations like disabled or elderly can prevent displacement as well. And they do have regulations around at least 50% of the households in the building be at low to moderate incomes. So there is an evaluation of tenants' income qualifying, and then also at least 50% of the associations must vote and be interested in actually moving forward with the acquisition of the building. Right here, you can see an image from Copeland Manor in Southeast DC. I was working with the National Housing Trust, which is a developer that only focuses on preservation of existing affordable housing. When I was able to work with the tenants of Copeland Manor, who had actually organized and come together and formed a tenant limited equity cooperative so that they could purchase their building when it went up for sale. So in 2006, the tenants were informed that their building was going up for sale and that they had the opportunity to form this ownership or make it or be involved in the acquisition of their building. And so with support from a system of nonprofits, they were educated and learned more about what a limited equity cooperative was. And they formed one, they made that decision to form one so that they could move forward with acquiring their building. They did that with support of Community Development Financial Institution Enterprise in the area. They were provided with a loan so that they could acquire the building within the time frame that was set within the act. And then they were empowered. I worked for National Housing Trust, and we were one of many developers that would approach tenant cooperatives such as this one, and offer to partner with them. And they were able to make the decision of which partner they wanted to go with. So they were empowered. They were allowed to discuss, to meet with different developers, discuss the opportunities, what they liked about one or the other, and select a development partner, which is very different than how we think of affordable housing operating today in the Bay Area. We think of landlords and tenants, but in this case, they were able to be partners. And so they moved forward with selecting a development partner. And because they were partners in the development, our job was not only to work with them to fund the acquisition, because what they had gotten was a bridge loan, but to access the local housing trust fund to fund the acquisition, but to also renovate the units, because these buildings in Washington, D.C. could be 50, 60 years old. And so it was really important for them to be able to not only control their housing situation and create stability, but also improve their housing by renovating the building. And so we were able to discuss with them their options, funding options, but also design teams, architects, contractors that they could work with. And all of this was an education process where they had the ability to make decisions and in partnership with us move forward. So I personally experienced what it was like to work with them and how enthusiastic they were about being educated in terms of what they could do to be able to live long-term where they had lived. Over 20% of the residents at Copeland Manor were living there for more than 20 years when it converted to a cooperative. So it really is an ability for folks to be able to create that long-term investment in place and stay in their communities. So with that, I will go to the next slide and pass it to Andrea.
Thank you, Regina. Hi, everybody. My name is Andrea Portillo. I'm the Community Organizing and Policy Manager with Somos Mayfair. And briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how Somos Mayfair, along with community and other partners, have been involved in the community engagement process for this policy and have strived to forward a community-driven solution around this policy. Next slide, please. So really quickly, a little bit about who we are. Vecinos Activos is part of the Somos Mayfair Community Organizing Committee. These are everyday neighbors who organize tenants, families in the Mayfair neighborhood through direct action and policy change. We're working with families to organize around issues of permanent affordability, neighborhood development without displacement, and other housing solutions like COPA. Through our process, we've been working with an array of great community partners and have formed our COPA working group. And so we're a group of community members and organizations advocating for community-centered anti-displacement strategies and solutions like COPA. So special shout out to all of our partners who have supported us with this work as well. Next slide, please. So before we jumped into working on this specific policy, Somos Mayfair and community that we work with, along with partners, again, have been advocating around anti-displacement strategies and housing justice advocacy and work for a very long time. And so we recognize the needs and we hear the needs from our communities every single day. We feel the sense of urgency from families in fear of being displaced, threats of eviction, the high cost of living. And so we worked with an artist named Felix Quintana to sort of put into visual all of the things that we've been feeling in our community, right? And so the first panel sort of highlights, the problems that we all know and we hear from within our community and are perhaps living some of these issues. We're sort of right now, I'm going to use the second panel to highlight, I think, where we are now in the moment around this specific policy. We're organizing, we're convening working groups and partners. We're working with the city. We're, informing community and doing some actions to get the word out and education around policy solutions like COPA. All striving to reach that last panel, right? A thriving city where communities feel supported, where they don't live in fear of displacement, where they're able to remain in their communities if they choose to, where folks have lived for sometimes generations. And so using this to sort of frame the problems that we're facing and hearing in terms of the housing crisis, and sort of shifting to the work that we are doing now. Next slide, please. So what have we been doing around this specific policy advocacy? So we've been supporting with community engagement and education piece of this work. Again, because we truly believe in community-centered and driven solutions. With the support, again, of several partners and community, we've hosted community COPA forums this past summer to not only support the community in understanding a policy like this, but also to gather their input on key aspects of the policy. Through citywide outreach and community engagement, we hosted 6 forums, including 2 in Vietnamese. Over 350 community members attended our forums. And again, we asked community-specific questions around the policy, including what income levels we should prioritize, the importance of tenant engagement and ownership opportunities for this specific policy. We learned a lot about what excited people about the policy, what concerned them, and also, more importantly, what was missing from this policy. And to do that, we learned a lot about some of the other policies in other jurisdictions and took, from that learning, really to build out, again, this community-driven and community-centered policy that addressed a lot of those gaps, right? And those needs that we're hearing from our communities every single day. And so together we created a community COPA framework, again, to ensure that the needs of our most impacted communities are reflected in this policy. So what did we hear? What did we hear from community? Obviously, the sense of urgency, and COPA is not going to solve all of our housing needs and address all of the needs that community has, but it's a tool. And a tool that we can use to really give folks in the community autonomy, voice, and decision-making power over their housing solutions. And that's very, very powerful and a very powerful shift in the way that we view housing in general and affordable housing here in San Jose and in the Bay Area. And that's what we heard from community, right? Solutions now, again, we feel that the real sense of urgency to prioritize our most impacted communities. And so folks really wanted a policy that prioritized tenant organizing, education, technical assistance and support, so that folks had autonomy and decision-making over their housing situations. And so that families, deserve and feel engaged and informed throughout this process of the policy. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight that we really heard from community was the importance of this policy, including pathways to ownership. We know that is really important, not just in terms of stability and security for folks, but ensuring that by ensuring that the properties under a COPA program remain permanently affordable, That may mean that families no longer have to work multiple jobs, and so that their income can go towards a savings account, a college savings account, or whatever else, you know, they would like to use that income for. So that also means that folks have more time to spend with their children, etc. So how do we ensure that this program has pathways to ownership, and knowing that ownership again can provide stability and security, but also really give folks more autonomy, and not have to, again, have their income goes just solely to paying rent. Next slide. So before I end, I really just wanted to uplift one of our leaders' stories, Norma Chavez. And her story not only highlights, again, the realities of families across the city of San Jose, folks that we all work with, but also speaks to why this policy is so important. Again, as an anti-displacement strategy, as a preservation tool for preserving affordable housing, and all of the possibilities that this policy can bring, all the opportunities that it could bring to folks within our community. So I'll let you all take a listen to that. Thank you.
Mi nombre es Norma Chavez. He vivido en el este de San José por más de 14 años. En este tiempo he sido desplazada 2 veces y sigo con la angustia de no tener una vivienda segura. COPA puede cambiar mi vida grandemente porque sería una luz para poder alcanzar mi sueño de tener una vivienda digna y segura. COPA es importante para mí y mi comunidad porque todos tendríamos las mismas oportunidades y beneficios que nos brinda al tener un hogar seguro, sin tener que preocuparnos el día de mañana buscando un hogar nuevo para mi familia, y no tendríamos la necesidad de dejar mi comunidad y mis amigos. Y mis hijos no sufrirían una vez más el desplazamiento, ya que ellos han sido los más afectados. Al vivir en una época en el año 2014, les tocó una mala experiencia al perder nuestra vivienda y terminar viviendo en un cuarto. La convivencia era muy poca porque no podíamos salir del cuarto, solo salíamos a hacer lo más necesario. Por ejemplo, ir al baño o de vez en cuando cocinar y comer encerrados en ese pequeño cuarto. La única manera de distraerlos era salir todo el día a la calle para hacerles el día alegre y poder disfrutarlos y distraerlos de la realidad. Es urgente que la ley COPA sea establecida en San José para que las familias y la comunidad ya no sufran más. Tener acceso a una vivienda y digna es un derecho humano. El momento es hoy y ahora. Mi nombre es Norma Chavez.
Thank you. So we hear stories like Norma's every day, and many of us share these same experiences. And so this is why Somos Mayfair, along with our community and partners, have been so strongly advocating for solutions like COPA. And then with that, I'm going to pass it to Huáscar, who's going to give us a little bit more context.
Thank you, Andrea. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Huáscar Castro, and I am the Associate Director of Housing and Transportation Policy, Working Partnerships USA. As Andrea mentioned, there's an ongoing COPA working group, and we're one of the partners in that working group. So we've been working alongside Somos and other partners on this really important policy campaign. And so I'm going to talk about a couple different things, but first I want to kind of hone in on the current status of the COPA campaign here in San Jose. So while we were expecting to have an April council hearing for COPA, due to various factors, there's been a delay with COPA, and that will likely be heard in fall or winter 2022. Still more to be heard on timing. Our coalition is adjusting to this new timeline, and we'll share more in a bit, others fellow panelists, on opportunities to engage in the meantime. Next slide, please. I also wanted to point out the opposition and narrative being used by the opposition, and not just the COPA campaign in San Jose, but in COPA, TOPA campaigns throughout the Bay Area. In COPA TOPA campaigns throughout the region, there's active opposition primarily rooted in special interests and mainly stems from the real estate lobbyist industry. So you may see a lot of different messaging and misinformation out there. And we just wanted to take an opportunity to note that and call that out. Primary opposition in various campaigns, but here in San Jose has been the Association of Realtors and the local chapter, the Santa Clara County Association of Realtors, the California Apartment Association, and the Bay Area Homeowners Network, also known as BON. Misinformation has been a key tactic, getting homeowners riled up about how this policy could impact one's home value and how COPA could add an additional level of bureaucracy. It's really important to note that these tactics are intended to incite fear among community members that are unfamiliar with the policy, when in fact jurisdictions such as Washington, D.C., as previously mentioned, have a fully staffed program to scale. In addition, there has been built out infrastructure towards preservation efforts in cities such as San Francisco prior to the enactment of COPA through what's known as their small sites program. In general, yes, staffing programs do take work, but this is an important piece of building out our city's preservation toolkit. I also just wanted to highlight an especially problematic example of the opposition's narrative, and that was used in the Berkeley TOPA campaign, where mainly folks from the real estate lobbyist industry were crafting this narrative about how this policy affects home ownership opportunities for families, and specifically for the ability for Black families to maintain home ownership opportunities. And they were using a lot of these tactics in different community groups. This is especially harmful because COPA is intended to be an anti-displacement solution. And based on irrefutable data, we're seeing that Black, Latinx, API communities have become increasingly at risk of displacement, not just in San Jose, but throughout the Bay Area. All that to note that it's worthwhile to be cognizant of false narratives that are being crafted around this issue. And it's also just in general recognize that it is taking place and to be aware of that. Next slide. And I believe I am passing it. Oh, that's on both, excuse me, I might have jumped the gun. So next slide. And I believe I'm passing it back to Andrea.
Yeah, thank you, Oscar. So as we know, our timeline for COPA making its way to City Council is a few months from now. And so while we've been working and advocating for this policy to make its way to Council at an earlier point, we feel the need to come out really strong and really let folks know why this policy is so important and the need to have it make its way to Council soon. Again, we all feel that urgency from community. And so a few call to actions for everybody here. The first one would be to join our COPA working group. Our next meeting is going to be Thursday, March 17th at 6:30 p.m. via Zoom. So we would love to have folks join us during that time, and we can make sure that everybody here receives a calendar invite or Zoom information for that link so you all can access that. Our second call to action, we are, obviously looking to build our base, get some more support around the movement that we're trying to build, not just with COPA, but for preservation in general and for really working together to build out this ecosystem that we know we need here in San Jose, and all of the possibilities that come with really fleshing out and building out the systems and the structures that we need to protect our folks from displacement. So you can fill out our Google form. Hopefully someone can help me drop it in the chat. If not, after I pass it on, I can drop that link in the chat for everybody. And then finally, we are having a march for COPA in March. So join us on March 29th at 1:30 p.m. We are meeting at the Mexican Heritage Plaza and we'll be marching to City Hall. Again, voicing our urgency. We really want council to prioritize this policy, to prioritize our communities, and to really take some action now to fight the displacement that we're seeing and feeling here in our communities. Thank you.
And also, I just wanted to highlight an ability to get involved in Affordable Housing Month. Unfortunately, this slide does not meet our accessibility standards, so I'm going to read it to make sure that everyone can have the information available here. Affordable Housing Month is the month of May, and SV at Home is excited that the theme of this year's Affordable Housing Month will be reimagining home with a focus on housing solutions produced from thinking outside of the box, deepening our knowledge base, and shifting our collective perspective on the equitable, inclusive, restorative communities that we want to result from our work. So again, just highlighting the ability to come out to these events and even offer events that may take place during Affordable Housing Month. The success of this event needs your support. We need your ideas for events and activities that you or your organization would like to host in the month of May. Examples are panel discussions, bike tours, grand openings of new affordable housing developments, groundbreakings, and there will be a Houser happy hour. For more information, please visit the link, and we'll make sure to share that link with folks who've attended. March 15th is the deadline to submit your event proposal form. So with that, I just, again, want to ask you all to consider hosting an event and also be on the lookout for Affordable Housing Month's events during the month of May. And I will, next slide, please. Great.
Thank you, Regina. And thank you, everybody who's can't come out today to see this great panel come together and explain to us exactly what is community ownership of land. And I actually wanted to shift us now to some questions and answers. So if you do have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat. We are taking those questions live. We also did receive some questions via RegFox. So I'm gonna turn to those first, but we are, like I said, taking questions live. So please put them in the chat. So the first question, it goes to the panel overall. It says, who could potentially manage community-owned housing in Santa Clara County? I'm not sure who wants to kind of tackle that.
I can maybe get us started. So basically, thinking more broadly about kind of the ecosystem that is really going to be required to be able to have like a robust network of organizations that are really dedicated to preserving affordable housing in San Jose. There's going to need to be kind of an all hands on deck approach. So you would be thinking about sort of the larger, more classic nonprofit housing organizations and developers. Your mid-pens of the world are definitely going to be part of that, and most likely are going to be some of the likeliest qualified nonprofits. You're also going to be looking at helping to develop more community-based nonprofits like Community Land Trust, including our South Bay Community Land Trust. You also want to be thinking about what are some tenant-owned or tenant-directed type models like cooperatives and limited equity cooperatives. And then lastly, you want to think about what kind of networked organizations can you work with? For example, like a Somos or another neighborhood-based organization that can partner with a CDC or with another nonprofit to be able to purchase and preserve housing as well. And so those kinds of capabilities would actually need to be developed over the next few years. They would also need to be funded, both at the project level, but also at the organizational level. So just thinking about making sure that, and this is kind of an issue around funding, that not only are the purchases funded, but also the staff that is required to be able to actually build up that capacity. Anybody else want to jump in?
I would also just add that in order to build out that ecosystem, it's going to take a lot of partners, but it's also going to take, I think, education around for community and in general for everybody, right? Around the possibility of these alternative models. I think we still have a long ways to go around informing folks that a South Bay CLT or a CLT model is possible, limited equity housing co-op models are possible. And so I think also thinking about the education piece that we all need in order to make that sort of system successful.
Thank you very much for that. And actually, Asen, to your point regarding TOPA, the next question is actually kind of in line with that. It says, COPA, TOPA policies are really expensive for individual cities to take on. What can be done at the local regional level to see these policies move forward in a way that is actionable while lessening the cost burden on individual municipalities?
Yeah, sure. And again, I'll get us started, but if other folks on the panel want to jump in, feel free to. I think it's really fair to say that on an individual deal basis, the quote unquote burden, I don't like to say it as a burden, the individual responsibility, how about that, of investing in affordable housing does fall pretty heavily on the jurisdiction. And of course, like figuring out ways that you can leverage other sources of funding would help alleviate some of that burden, but also potentially help you not just preserve more housing, but more types of housing, and there'll be a much greater variety of the kinds of buildings that you're looking at. This is one of the things that we looked at when we were doing the research in the community engagement process. We kind of saw that at the lower end of the unit sizes, you actually end up with a much higher per unit cost. And so in order to be able to really focus on some of these smaller properties where we know a lot of working families are living in, you would probably need to go and look at ways to leverage multiple sources of revenue. And so most likely that's going to be coming from either funding at the county level, sources like Measure A, for example, but also looking at any sort of potential sources at the regional level. And then currently seeing that there is an interest at the state to really invest in affordable housing, making sure that some of those state resources can be drawn down to help support the preservation of housing. I don't know if other folks want to jump in.
No, I mean, I would echo, sorry, Regina. Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Asen said, and I think that having a local contribution is very important. And I think looking at local funding opportunities, which in San Jose exist, such as looking at the commercial linkage fee and seeing how we can maximize that, looking at Measure E and making what was intended to be a flexible spending mechanism and how that can work towards preservation efforts, but also want to make a note that there are opportunities at the regional level. Due to state legislation, there has been the creation of what's known as the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, and there is a proposed spending plan which does have some dollars allotted for preservation. And also too, there's a grander goal within what's Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, also known as BAFA, to put potentially put a ballot measure for a regional funding measure to get more much needed funding for a various slew of housing solutions. And at the forefront of this conversation, preservation has been discussed at that level already. So those are some regional options tied to, of course, the really important piece of a local contribution.
I was just going to offer that, preservation is so critical to the ecosystem of affordable housing because it is more cost effective in a lot of ways. Not just the fact that, new construction per unit has a very high cost, especially right now in the Bay Area. And so preserving these affordable units as affordable is really a benefit to the community and a cost-effective way of maintaining and increasing affordable housing, but also just the cost on our community of the trauma of displacement. I think that's something that, we don't ground ourselves enough in the reality of what it costs, not just individuals or families, but whole communities, local governments, us all, when we have large numbers of our neighbors and our community members being displaced at high rates, and then adding the trauma of that. And so, the cost, as Asen said, it's hard to think of a burden on a government without thinking of, how rent burdened so many of our families are. and how they're paying, more than 50% of their income on rent and housing expenses, and what that costs our communities in terms of how it affects their ability to be, mothers and fathers, and to provide for their children, and to do all of the other things that make our society, helps us thrive, us all thrive.
Wow, what a way to bring that all together, Regina. Thank you so much for that. I do think when we think of costs, it's always in the dollar form, but are we taking into account the emotional, traumatic impacts that these changes are having on our communities? Thank you for that, and thank you all for those amazing answers.